So we are on page Kuf Pei Hey, in the second paragraph. So yesterday we saw that the biggest problem that philosophers had, philosophy in general had, was how could the many come out of the one? So his answer, why is that a problem? Because if the many
hand can lay a million eggs and then many comes out of one. See, a human being who could develop as a man and a woman and they can have 10 children is the whole world from beginning to end.
No, because you see that there has to be an input on one side for there to be an output on the other. And you don't want to say that Hashem is inputting something in order to make many. You're not talking about propagation. You're not talking about that he's having children. That's not the right example. You want to say that everything is Hashem. Nothing needed to be added. It's just that Hashem now appears to you as many, many different things.
Okay, he doesn't have to show you everything all the time. He has a cupboard.
It's fine. It doesn't matter. Intellectually, there's no good explanation. So they got stuck there. And you might say, he'll address the Rambam later on. But if you follow just Greek philosophy, if you just follow the pshat of the Rambam, then
you want to say the Rambam is Greek philosophy?
Yeah, of course. He's based on Greek philosophy. That was the science of the time. The Rambam was able to unify Torah with the science of his time. That was a tremendous feat. That's acknowledged by everybody. Science since then has changed, so you can't fall back on that. But again, the science of that time, instead of calling it philosophy, call it the science of their time. Okay, it didn't have an understanding, a grasp of how the one could become many. It didn't work.
Why can't you just fall back and say, well, Hashem is omnipotent and he can do whatever he wants?
Fine, you could say that, but that's not science, right?
That's
That's hand waving. It's called hand waving. It's called religion. Yeah. Settle, but you want to understand. I can throw everything. But if there's a way to understand, I want to understand. Wait. Fine. The point is, if you were religious and you were observant, so it didn't matter to you whether you understood or didn't understand. You still did what the Torah said. Okay? But now you want to understand also.
What do you mean by observant? You watch everything that's going on around you, or you
keep the mitzvahs?
It's interesting. It's the same word.
Okay. Hurt the fact that people were religious and observant. That didn't matter, but you want to understand. So when you want to understand, what are you going to use? You need to use the science of your time. With the Greek science, there was no way, again, Greek science, I mean philosophy, there was no way to get to this idea that from the one came the many. This just simply didn't work. Not the one that we're talking about, the one that doesn't need anything. That didn't work. So there was a lack of language in which to explore this idea, with which to have the mind understand this idea. You couldn't wrap your head around it. There were no words for it. One of the goals of Kabbalah and Chassidut is to give a new language so that you have words to describe things that, though we accept in faith, we would like to be able to understand. I mean, you can throw everything into it's beyond our understanding bin and forget about it. But that's not how people work. People want to understand things. Okay? So this was a big question. And that's how we ended.
Didn't have Chassidus.
What?
The Rambam didn't have Chassidus.
Right, he didn't have. That's why Kabbalistic language was invented and Hasidic language was invented, because there is more to the world that we could use to explain these things than what Greek philosophy, science, and the Rambam knew about. Or at least they didn't quite state it in the language that Chassidus and Kabbalah states it. And the moment that you change the language, or in this case we'll see that the moment you see some examples of it, then you suddenly are able to grasp it. Okay, and again, the question here is not about how Hashem creates the world. The question here is, how is He capable of having divine providence over everything? How does that work? That's the real question here. It's not the question of how the world was created is secondary here. It's just that that will lead us to the language that will allow us to understand what the Torah means when it says, Erda na ve'ere. I will go down in order to see.
But isn't it a Kal V'chomer, the different Kodesh Baruch Hu created the world? And if you accept that, then isn't it obvious that he must be controlling the whole world?
No, not at all. Why? We said that their maskana, their conclusion from their science was that that's not the case. That Azav Hashem et haaretz, God is not connected to the details below. In the Greek picture, and it's the picture that the Rambam accepted, okay? Except for we'll see later on that he adds a trap door in their whole system that accommodates divine providence. But in the Greek system, it was impossible for God to know what was going on in the lower details, because God is the first mover. He's the guy who starts it all. He's the first input of energy into the system. And if it propagates down, it's fine, but it doesn't go back up. There's no way that he can know what's going on with the details.
They didn't understand Hashem.
They had a certain understanding. You're right. They had a certain understanding of the mechanics of the universe. And we call that ishtalshelus. We call that, once there's Hasidic language, and we have other ways of describing what's going on in the world, so that way of looking at things is called ishtalshelus. And I told you many times that the mashal for this, the parable for this, is a billiard ball table. Okay, and when the billiard ball, the first one that you knock, right, knocks into another one, it doesn't know where the other one is going to go. It certainly doesn't know where the third one, the one that's going to get knocked further down the line, is going to go.
The person who hit the ball knows.
What?
The person who hits the ball knows. If I'm playing billiards and I've got a ball here,
but there you have the problem. But there you have.
The balls can move.
But there you have the problem that you only know because you go back to look at what actually happened. But if you were stuck in your place and you couldn't move, imagine yourself not as a person, but imagine yourself as the billiard stick. The stick doesn't know where it's going to go.
Okay, but the stick is a tool in my hand.
Again, so you have a whole different conceptual scheme. They didn't have this conceptual scheme that behind the stick there is yet consciousness. That wasn't their picture of it. It was mechanistic in the same way that you don't think that nature knows.
Where did they assume the universe came from? It just fell into place?
No, so we said that there's energy and there's matter. Energy is God. He's the one who adds the energy. And the matter always existed. It just made it animate. What God added made it animate. When that's your picture, right? There's balls on the table. There's a stick in your hand. You didn't create either of them, and now you use one to hit. You use the stick to hit the balls. That's the picture of the universe that they had. You don't. You may, at some level, maybe you have a method of knowing things. Maybe you have a method of later on knowing where something ended up. But you certainly can't affect it once it's out of your hand. Imagine, can you change the direction that a ball will go in after you've hit it?
Sure, just pull it down.
Then you have to have a way to touch it. But again, in their picture, that you're not allowed, like in billiards, you're not allowed to touch the ball directly. You can only use the stick to hit one of them. So that's the picture that they had. It's a very mechanistic picture, and it's seems that's why it's called ancient Greece, because it's primitive. It was a long time ago. Some of their stuff still holds. Most of it doesn't. Okay? But we have an issue because the Rambam took that and he brought it into his halachic work. He brought it into his legal work. He took the basis or the basics of the Greek system and he brought them in. So he said this holds forever. So it's true. It's not wrong. There is such a description of the universe, which is fine. There's nothing wrong with it. It just doesn't account for everything. That's all. It accounts for what they knew back then. So the Rambam, in order to account for some of our beliefs, he had to add another clause that's different from everything that they said, and that clause saves the call it the faith that God has providence. He has to add that. That doesn't appear in Aristotle's writings.
Negated divine providence?
No, of course not. Of course he believes in divine providence.
Words.
What?
He used the expression.
Of course, that he knows everything.
He knows, but knowing everything is not the same as.
And in his and he writes, and he guides everything. Yeah. Hu asa oseh v'yaseh lechol ha'ma'asim. He is the one who does, did, and will do all actions. Okay. He says that. Okay. Anyway, so what changed? What changed was that they slowly they came to in the time of Chassidus. I'm talking about it didn't start 200 years ago. It started even earlier. There were certain things that in the Greek system were left unaccounted for. They didn't talk about this. Why didn't they talk about it? Because they had a different picture of it. They had a mechanistic picture of it. But the moment you have a non-ishtalshelus picture of the nefesh, of the psyche, you begin to find that in the world there are also examples of non-mechanistic things going on. Okay? This is a big issue. This is a huge issue because the big battle in science has always been, are we going to be materialist reductionists, or are we going to accept that there are other mechanisms at work? Okay, if you're a reductionist, you're a materialist, you say that in the end, everything is only matter. Okay? Everything is just billiard balls knocking up against each other. Okay? So that's most scientists intuitively fall into that picture of reality. Most scientists will. Because intuitively you would like things to work mechanically. When does it fall apart? When you start looking at psychology. The truth is, when you start looking at the human body, it falls apart. When you start studying anything that has to do with the mind, it completely falls apart. And because of that, for instance, quantum mechanics, which is an attempt to mechanize the behavior of particles, small particles, quantum, that come in packets, also falls apart in that account, because there's something strange going on there that apparently the observer has an effect. There's an effect of the observer. So the moment you add the mind into anything, then you begin to see that the billiard ball explanation of the universe is just not good enough. It doesn't explain everything.
The quantum theory of mechanics specifically says that the observer can change the outcome?
No. It doesn't say that, it sees that. It's an observation. That something happens that causes what we call the wave function to collapse. Something happens that, in simple terms, from the many different possibilities, we get one and not another, and it seems to be completely random. Meaning, we can't find a mechanism that makes it happen. So, from the time the quantum mechanics was discovered, Niels Bohr suggested that it's what we call the effect of the observer. There's a contribution from somebody who observes the system. And as long as the system has not been observed, nobody's looked at it, no consciousness has come in contact with it, then the system is in a state of, it's not defined yet. It's a state of what we call all the possibilities are still open. They all coexist. And one of them will be chosen at some point, but we don't know why one in particular. But we know that happens only when consciousness comes to touch the system. So somehow the mind has something to do with it. What it has to do with it, how it works, nobody knows. And there are those who will say, nonsense. There's no such thing. We just haven't figured it out yet, because they want to be materialist reductionists. So they want it to be just billiard balls. So there must be a mechanical explanation why when the mind comes in contact with it, there's nothing magical going on. It's just that some particle is emitted from brains, I don't know what, and that particle is what causes the function to collapse, and you get this one result, and not I keep forgetting the word, where all the possibilities are one on top of the other. I don't remember how you say that. It's a beautiful mathematical word, but I don't remember. Anyway, okay. So in order to explain this new language, he's going to give us now a number of different examples, right? So there's a principle in Chassidus that you need to give at least, if you want to talk about something in godliness, and here he wants to talk about divine providence, you have to give two examples of the same thing, one in nature and one in psychology. Okay? So that's what he's going to do now. He's going to give us more than two examples, but first of all, he's going to give us an example in nature of what he means by this new way of describing things, and he's going to give us an example in psychology. Okay? ולהבין באר היטב אופן מציאות השפעה אשר אינו בערך המשפיע. To really understand what we're talking about, how it's possible that what comes out of something is like skipped out, and it's not directly a reflection of what created it. Again, in billiard balls, you can't get a billiard ball to knock into another one and turn it into an egg. Right? It doesn't happen. But here, that's what you're saying. That the stick, the thing that started it, when it hits, it turned one of the billiard balls into an egg. Because you're saying that somehow it has an effect which is more than the matter that existed before. It's doing something. Okay? Like he said, that this will explain how from one can come many. We'll see an example now. So he says, ויימצא מציאות שאינו בערך כמו מציאות 10 ספירות בהתחלקות מבחינת אחדות הפשוטה. And the thing we want to get to is how there are 10 ספירות, even though God is only one. יובן ממשל צמיחת פירות ועשבים מבחינת כוח הצומח. So the first example is from nature. How is it that from the power of growth in the earth, there come different types of fruit and grasses, or herbs? We see that from the same earth, there come very different types of plants. One is sweet, and one is bitter, and this one is pleasant. But they all came out of the same power of growth. So how is it possible? So what would we say today? What do you mean, how is it possible? There's different DNA, right? One seed has this DNA, the other seed has that DNA. Okay.
But the earth is the thing that starts the process.
Right. So we don't mean here, he's not giving a scientific explanation. He's showing you an example in your day-to-day life that will illustrate. A mashal is not meant to be the explanation. It's meant to be an illustration. And it's up to you to figure out what this illustration is saying. So the fact that we have a mechanistic explanation today of why this is happening doesn't take away from it as an illustration. Okay? It's very important. We have a very mechanistic explanation for why it is that DNA from one seed, which is different from DNA in another seed, one will grow wheat and the other one will turn into an apple tree. We have a mechanistic explanation of that. Okay? But the illustration is still relevant. So what's the illustration? That you have one source that's propagating, that's allowing a whole spectrum of results to come out from it. Okay? So now the question is, does the source also contain the end result? Meaning, does the ground from which they both grow contain in it sweetness and bitterness both together?
That's a difference of opinion. If you go according to Tanya, And it's the earth itself which is causing the thing to grow. And if you look at DNA, it's not like that.
Again, so the question is, do you need to drop the Tanya's mashal, this illustration? He says, no, you don't need to drop it, because the fact that we have a different mechanism to explain it doesn't take away from the question. Because it's an illustration. We're not trying to say this is how it works. We're just saying, look at what you see. What do you see? You see that the same ground gives power of growth to completely different fruits, completely different herbs. So somebody would say, but that's exactly what we mean by reductionism. Reductionism means when you break down the process, you see that there's nothing magical happening here. That's fine. He's not claiming that something magical is happening here. He's saying, what do you see? It's an illustration. It's not meant to be, this is how God creates the Sfirot. That's not the, understand? Yaakov, you get it? He's not trying to tell you, look, God created the Sfirot the way that the earth gives forth growth to apples and lemons. What?
One is physical and one is spiritual.
That's also true. But again, the point of an illustration is just to show you how to think about it. It's not that the mechanism here is what's important. We understand it. We understand that whenever you're a reductionist and you think like the Greeks, you're going to look and maybe find a relatively good mechanistic billiard ball explanation for what's going on. But that's not what we're asking. We're asking, is there a different way to look at this? To use this illustration to understand something that I can't understand. To have an example of it. So he says, there must be something in the earth, again, as an illustration, that is the source of both sweetness and bitterness in the fruit. Now, he doesn't mean mechanistically, because he's not telling you, look, if you take a piece of earth, you can break it up and find where it's sweet and where it's bitter. That's nonsense. That's not what he's saying. He's saying there's some power in the earth that is allowing those two tastes to come out later, but it's the same power. Okay? So again, we have to say before we continue what this is called. He in all the examples he gives, he never says the word, but the word is islapshus. It's enclothement. Enclothement requires light and a vessel. So here the power of the earth to grow, that's the light. And the DNA is the vessel. That's how we would take the mechanistic picture that we have today, and just by changing it a little bit, you understand what he wants to say here. So, is there a source for the bitterness in the, I don't know, what kind of, in the olive, okay, that came from the earth? Is there a source in the earth? Is there a source for the sweetness of the apple in the earth? So again, mechanistically, somebody would say, no, he's not saying you can taste it there. Because it's not there, you won't find it. But does it cause it down the line? Yes. כי באמת, בחינת כוח הצומח אינו בערך הצמיחה בטעמים גשמיים כלל. הוא בעצם פשוט, ואינו בערך כלל וכלל טעמים הגשמיים הנצמחים. You can't find the tastes in the earth. You can't find these sweetness and bitterness if you taste the ground. But there is a power of growth in the ground that causes these.
But the people in the times of Noah could taste it.
Yeah, so...
They knew from the taste it would grow.
Yeah, again, that's a mashal. I don't believe for a second that they could do it physically.
I know.
Because it's not there physically. What they could do is the same thing that a wise person can do when he looks at a young child and he says, this is the type of person that can come out of this child. It's not there yet. But the wise person, he can see what the source is capable of producing. But it's not that he can see the old child inside the young child. That's ridiculous. He can't see it. what is he seeing? He's seeing the potential. So they saw potential. What do you mean they saw potential? They knew that this kind of type of ground is good for this, that type of ground is good for that. In which way did they do it? Maybe they tasted it. But they didn't taste sweetness or bitterness in it.
No.
They tasted that this is the type of ground that's good for these types of, and there might be something to it. I don't know. Okay? But the point is, though, that we call the power of growth, whatever starts the growth in the ground, we call that an etzem pashut. והוא עצם פשוט, ואינו בערך כלל וכלל לטעמים הגשמיים הנצמחים. And the etzem pashut, the simple substance, the substrate, does not have sweetness or bitterness in it. You can't taste those tastes in the substrate. ולכך יכול להיות שהמציאות כולם יחד להיות כי טעם גשמי מר מתוק הוא שאין יכולים להתחבר להיות מורגשים בטעמים גשמיים. So it could be, he says, not could be, it is that all the tastes in a way already exist in the source. But it's not, again, you can't taste them because something is missing. It has to propagate down. And what that propagation is it's not mechanistic. That's what he wants to claim. Why? Because if the power of the power of growth of the earth can cause both an apple tree and an olive tree to come out. And again, it's not that you need to put olive trees in something other than earth. You don't put them in the air. They both, the apple tree and the olive tree, come from the same ground. So there must be some common denominator in the ground that is lending itself, or as we'll say, enclothing itself in the DNA of the olive tree seed and in the DNA of the apple tree seed. Some force that comes before both of them. And it's what enlivens both of them. Okay? And that's called an essential force, a substance. והנה, הרי מכל מקום, איתו יימצא בחינת התחלקות ממש, ובטעמים משונים בהרגשה, מובן מזה שבחינת עצם הפשוט שאינו בערך המהות הנמצא, וגם אינו בערך התחלקות, כמו בחינת כוח צומח שאינו בערך מהות טעם הגשמי כנ"ל, ולכך אינו שם בבחינת התחלקות כלל להיותו עצם פשוט, ומכל מקום יימצא ממנו מציאות טעם גשמי, ובהתחלקות פרטים כנ"ל. It says, so this is the first example, that you have one common source, which is being expressed as opposites. Okay? And you can't find the opposites in the source itself. That's the main thing. You can't find it there. If you look for it, you won't find it. So that's the first mashal. This is called enclothement. Bitterness and sweetness. You can't find the bitterness and the sweetness in the ground. They're not there. Okay? What's the mashal that we would use? The simplest mashal for isnapshus, for enclothement, we've talked about this many times, is the soul inside the body. So comes the scientist, and he says, I don't believe there's a soul. Show it to me. What do you say? I can't. Can't help you. Why can't I help you? Because it's not material. If it was material, it should be seen in some way. You should find some instrument that can measure it, but it's not material. So he says, if it's not material, I don't want to hear about it. It's not real. He says, it's not true, because look, before 1860, okay, there was no Maxwell laws of electromagnetism. Okay, Maxwell hadn't written his laws yet. So what did you have? So you had these electrical phenomena, and nobody understood what it was. Is it material? If it's material, how does it work? Can we store it? Can we do this? Can you hold it? Show me matter, I can always hold it. What do you do with that? So Maxwell did something incredible. He ignored that question. He said, I don't care. I don't know what it is. I think he pretty much knew it wasn't matter already. I think they knew already. So they ignored the question of what is it, and they decided just to describe what it does, and try to quantify what it does. And so he came up with these wonderful mathematical laws that describe everything that has to do with electromagnetism. It was great. But the question still remained, what is it? To this day, nobody knows. Nobody knows what electromagnetism is. I mean, we know how to use it, but we don't know what it is. Why? Because sometimes you have to ignore the question of what is it and just deal with the effects, with what you see. That was a stroke of genius. The same thing happened. James Clerk Maxwell is English. England once in a while had bright people. So, why do I bring this up? Because with the soul, it's the same problem. I don't know what it is, but to say it doesn't have an effect, why would it not? Everything that you talk about in psychology, that's the soul.
So you have an effect, but you know what's causing it.
Right. I have no idea. I can't tell you what it is. So somebody says, we do know what it is. I'm telling you, we don't know what it is. We know how to make it happen. We have no idea what it is. So the interesting thing was that they used, when Maxwell described this, and then later when circuit theory was developed and many other things, so they used illustrations or parables from the material world. So you get something called current. And current, in people's mind, is a current of water, right? There's water going through a pipe. So people imagine that there are, because they told them that electrons have something to do with electromagnetism, so they imagine that electrons are going through the wires. Nonsense. Electrons are not going anywhere. They're simply not going anywhere. At most, they're moving some atomic distance, but they never leave the molecule that they're in. They don't go anywhere. So what is being propagated? Well, it's not current in the sense of something moving. Sometimes when it's better for us, we treat electricity as moving in both directions. It depends on how you're solving the circuit. So sometimes you say the current is going forward, and sometimes you say there's a negative current going backwards. And it's fine because mathematically it doesn't matter as long as you're consistent and helps you solve the circuit. It doesn't matter. In reality, we have no clue. Nobody knows. And it doesn't matter. But we stayed with these metaphors because for our mind, we usually think of things materially because that's easiest to grasp. But the moment you add this thing called enclothement, so there's a whole new world opens up. And the first thing he says is that in enclothement, you can have one source giving
many things, many things.
Giving energy, if you want. You don't know what it is even, to many different effects. And they're different from each other. It's not, again, yesterday we gave the question. A chicken can only lay eggs. Chickens don't lay dollar bills. They don't lay, what a shame, yeah. Golden nuggets. They don't do that. But that's because it's a billiard ball game. There's only so much they can do. You hit a billiard ball, there's only so much that can happen on the table. But when you're talking about a force that is enclosed, it enters into something. If it enters into something, then depending on that something, it can give birth to completely different results. So the ground propagates into an olive tree, which is bitter, and into an apple tree, which is sweet.
Yeah, but then again, we're going back to what we said before. There's not actually the ground. The ground is just...
no, the force in the ground, right? The force of growth, right? He's not saying it's the ground itself. He says it's something in the ground. Basically, what he's saying is the ground and everything here. The second mashal, which we don't need to read, we can just say it very quickly, is that the psyche gives birth to eyesight, to mechanical force, to speech, to hearing. It does all these things. The same psyche, which you see that it's one, because when it leaves, everything is like shut down all at once. it also does the same thing. So the ground here is like the brain, and what's in the brain is the psyche, is the soul, and that's what's giving forth all these different phenomena, and they're completely different from one another. So those are two examples, one in nature, one in psychology, that describe a different way of looking at the universe. Unless you have this other way of looking at things, you can't understand what Kabbalah wants. Because Kabbalah is now saying, in the time of the Greeks, all you could understand about God was that he was mechanistic. But Judaism believes that he's more than that. So what is more than that? Here's more than that. That he can create many different things from one source. And where do I have an example? So somebody will come and say, but that's not creation. Because again, the object has to have had existence even before this force came into it. But that's okay, because we're not talking about creation here. We're talking about providence. Okay? This is not about creation. Creation is more difficult. Creation is a different question. Creation is a different type of leap. And by creation, we have a bigger problem to explain. But he's not going to deal with that in this essay. In this essay, he's only talking about providence. Providence, what does providence assume? It assumes there's some object that you want to know about. So the object already exists. Good? It's here. I just want to know about it. So how can someone who's not Beseder, he can. Why? In the same way that the mind, or mind is the wrong word, but the soul propagates, it enters into different vessels, into the eye, into the ear, and it creates different effects.
So you're moving from Malik or not Soda to Malik.
So, okay, in a certain sense. Right.
I'm glad you said this is an easy Malik.
I didn't say it was easy. I meant a different one. This is actually a shortened version. Really what we want is the end. So I don't know what we'll do with it. I think we'll finish it this week, because I said it's a short mimer. I didn't say it's easy. It's easier because if we would read he has a longer version of this in Torah's Chaim, which is, like I said yesterday, he opens up basically a mimer in Torah Or. And in Torah's Chaim, it's very, very long. It's like, I think 30, double column, huge pages. It's really huge. And what he does there he starts from a different point of view. He starts from reading the Patach Eliyahu, because that's what the original mimer in Torah Or is about. It's about Patach Eliyahu. So the Patach Eliyahu is part of the introduction to the Tikkunei Zohar. It's a very ancient piece. It's not part of the Tikkunei Zohar for sure. Whoever wrote the Tikkunei Zohar found it and put it in. And the Patach Eliyahu gives 3.5 different conceptions of the universe. Okay? And that's what he analyzes in the big mimer. But it's very, very clear. He explains everything very clearly. Here, it's a very condensed version, and he only mentions the Patach Eliyahu in passing. So imagine what happened was that this was like he didn't have time to, so he had to say it quickly. So he didn't teach it through the Patach Eliyahu, he just taught it through all these examples. But they both deal with the same question. What is divine providence? How is it possible? Okay, but we'll continue tomorrow.
It's tough on my brain.
Yeah, I had a feeling this didn't work.